Whoa, I just shot off that man's skin. So yeah, this game's a little bit different. Vivisector Beast Within is a first-person shooter which is set in the 1980s, I think. That doesn't really matter. You're a marine or a spec op sent to a distant island under the guise of containing a rebellion. And when you get there, your squad's slaughtered by teleporting electrical dogs. And it then turns out this island is home to experimental weapons of war, which are machine and animal mixed. You just travel around the island, you unearth its secrets, then you escape. It's honestly a very simple narrative, but what really does not stand out to me as simple is the degree that Action Forms, the developer, went to create an atmosphere. This game's not overly unique in its style, and it kinda reminds me of the original Far Cry. Like, even the level design is actually somewhat similar. It also reminds me of Chrome, which is just a sci-fi Far Cry. So, first off, I do want to say I'm very sorry about the 4:3 aspect ratio of the video. I tried to get the work at 16:9 at 1080p, but it just did not want to work. Kept on crashing and weird HUD anomalies. It was all sorts of just nightmare fuel. But that aside, graphically this game for its time is actually pretty alright. The game's very flat looking, but it also has these massive expansive levels. The game doesn't exactly have crisis levels of open worldness. You do travel just from one side to the other of a large open map, but it does have secrets littered across these large areas, which is cool. These great expansive environments are kind of empty, to be fair. They have some grass, some trees, maybe some rocks, and the terrain is made in such a way as to block out anything in the distance. Because of this, you mainly fight in valleys or next to large mountains. This is probably a way to reduce how many world objects had to be placed on screen at any one time. It probably also let them have much more world objects in a smaller area, so more densely packed and more densely detailed. Which, again, because of these mountains and the valleys and what have you, actually makes these environments look way bigger than they are. So that's kudos to the developers, using limited resources to make something good. Kind of like Silent Hill with the fog, for example. Furthermore, enemy models are detailed enough, and because of this game's destruction system, they look really fucking cool when they're like blown apart and destroyed. You can blow the skin off of nearby enemies to expose their like bones and their muscles. It's really kinetic and really fun. Some enemies even have spots that can't be blown apart, which act as armor, which means that their fleshy bits are weak points. It's a really interesting way to flesh out the combat. I do want to talk candidly about atmosphere for a little bit here. I think it's one of this game's strongest assets, if not their strongest. I think it's incredibly well crafted. From the get-go of this game, it really wants you to know that something's off about the island. When you drop in, everything's eerily quiet. There's atmospheric sounds, but there's not much else. You get asked to investigate a building which is empty apart from a radio beacon. And then when you go to leave, the door gets blocked and all of a sudden you hear the screams, gunfire outside, fire. And when you eventually get the door open, you're greeted by your ex-girlfriend being mauled by a teleporting dog. And the message, it's trying to convey that this island is not yours. It is a hostile place home to animals that defy the laws of physics, and they really want you dead. And not too long after that, you come across signs that maybe these dogs aren't so in control of their newfound powers. You find them fused into walls, fences, the ground, and you get reminded that these are just dogs who can teleport. Another victim of some experiment, maybe. Which is only driven home by the fact that every enemy in this game is based off of a real-life animal. There's no weird alien things here, it's humans and animals. It's very realistic in that way. Not that the premise is at all realistic, it's just grounded. And that really helps set the tone for what is a game that is, for me, really interesting as a case study. It's a great idea attached to a game that maybe could have been executed a little differently. And a lot of this game's flaws are in the gameplay. It's just too simple. You aim your crosshair and you pull the trigger. There's no point of difference between it and any other generic shooter in terms of gameplay. It's perfectly average. It's not cover-based. It's technically more of a motion shooter, but it still forces you to slow down and take shots from behind cover. The only real change from other games from the same year and the years, around it is just how hard the game is. Enemies hit back hard. It's not exactly even in terms of damage between you and them, but it's close. One enemy is more than enough to fuck you up. And this means you have to play tactically and kind of slowly at times, especially with ranged enemies, of which there are many. with some having godlike reflexes or weapons that could one-shot you, especially in the last quarter of the game. Melee enemies make up a large bulk of the game, but they can easily be dealt with by circle strafing, which kind of does just make melee enemies not all that challenging on their own, but when they're in groups they can easily overrun you if you aren't careful. But in terms of what the gameplay is actually like, it's this like kind of strange mix between a corridor shooter and this large, expansive environmental shooter, kind of like Far Cry. You'll find yourself sniping enemies in a massive valley and then moving inside a compound to dispatch enemies up close and personal with a shotgun. The arsenal in this game is definitely one of the more impressive parts of it. It totals 15 weapons, including a knife and one type of grenade, so 13 actual guns in other words. They range from a pistol to a Tesla cannon, and yeah, of course, a shotgun too. Well, two shotguns, a pump action and a semi-automatic twin-barrel shotgun. And I am happy to report that most of the weapons feel good to use. They're not the best in the business, but they don't necessarily need to be. My favourite weapon to use is the M60 because it just tears through enemies, which really helps show off the destruction effects on enemies, and it just also sounds brilliant, which I think is probably the most impressive thing about this game technically. It still sounds really good, especially by today's standards. The growl of a weird panther machine fin in the grass next to you sounds really good. You know what the animal is, where it is, and what it's about to do. The quality of the sound is not up to scratch of today's standards in terms of like accuracy, realism. It still sounds shit. In terms, it's a very low resolution sound file, but the implementation is very much there. Whether you're shooting metal armor off an enemy or riding around a jeep, it all sounds accurate. It has just the right amount of reverb to every gunshot or to a distant explosion. It's all very well constructed and realised. Which brings me to this game's biggest problem, and that problem is just quite simply what it isn't. This game's narrative is so displaced from its gameplay. I talked earlier about the atmosphere that the game opens with and how it's very impressive, but the game quickly drops that in favour of this B-movie narrative. I know this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you because you probably haven't played the game or know literally anything about its narrative other than the premise I gave you at the video's intro. So before I continue with the problems, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the narrative, and it'll be quick, I promise, because if you've seen my videos, you know my narrative rundowns are never quick, but I'll be quick this time, I promise. So, the island you are sent to is besieged by mechanically engineered and enhanced animals who were created by Dr. Moorhead, this insane scientist who once upon a time modified a human baby with animal genetics to create the perfect match of the two. That baby was then taken to the mainland by his military general and the trail went cold on where that baby went. And many years later, the animal rebellion underway and you were sent in to stop a human rebellion. Your squad gets fucking destroyed, you regroup with another squad sent in many weeks prior. You soon learn that you basically just have to kill Moorhead to escape the island, but Moorhead has other plans. It turns out that you are that baby that he modified all those years ago, and his master plan is to make you trust him so you can lead the new world order, because he believes you are the most powerful being on the planet. And that's that. It's a really weak narrative, and I don't like it. I think it has heaps of promise if it was developed more, but it's also just one that it does keep you guessing until the very end of its many twists and turns. So if that's what you're looking for, if you want something that will keep you engaged, but also falls apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny, then maybe you'll like it. But to me, it just wastes that wonderful narrative the game's intro and first few chapters build. This game, if it stuck to that creepy, almost horror-like style it had at the beginning, it could have been a really, really interesting game. The slow building tension towards the reveal that you're just another experiment could have been interesting. You know, the game doesn't need to be a survival horror either. It could still just be a shooter, but the plot needs to change so that this atmosphere can grow. Which I know that these devs can do. They wanted to make Cryostasis Sleep of Region, which is an incredibly well-made psychological horror. So they obviously have the skill to do something more neurotic with their work. But for whatever reason, didn't. And I don't want to stop this video and just say, don't buy this game, you won't like it. Because even though I think the direction of the game is honestly not what I would personally do or what I personally like, I still played through all of it and I still enjoyed it. Even with multiple game-breaking and level-breaking bugs that caused me to apply God mode or to skip levels entirely because of faulty event triggers, the game is still fun. But it could have been so much more if they were more concrete with the direction they wanted to go. Because as it stands, what they have, what Vivisector has to offer is worth your time. It's fun, it's somewhat different, and the narrative is actually, it's interesting enough to keep you. It has some cool ideas and some exciting moments, and some really inventive enemy design, and it's freeware, so there's no money needed, so just go play it. And see if you think too that it's got some wasted potential. Thanks for watching.